The cafe on Maple Street had become my Saturday morning ritual, though I couldn't say exactly when it had shifted from occasional convenience to genuine necessity. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the large front windows, casting everything in a soft, forgiving glow that made even the gray Seattle mornings feel manageable. Or maybe it was simply that this place existed in a pocket of the city where no one from my office would ever think to venture, where I could sit with my laptop and pretend that the quarterly reports sprawled across my screen were actually the beginning of the novel I kept telling myself I'd write someday. This particular Saturday felt heavier than most. The October sky hung low and threatening, the kind of weather that made you want to burrow deeper into your jacket and postpone all plans indefinitely. I'd claimed my usual table by the window, a small round thing that wobbled slightly if you leaned too hard on one side, and had been nursing the same cup of coffee for the better part of an hour while trying to make sense of the budget projections that Marcus had dumped on my desk Friday afternoon with his typical cheerful disregard for weekends. The numbers blurred together on my screen: revenue streams, operational costs, projected growth. All of it felt abstract and distant, like I was reading about someone else's life in a language I only half understood. At 32, I'd somehow become the kind of person who spent Saturday mornings in cafes working on spreadsheets, and I wasn't entirely sure how that had happened. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Saturdays meant sleeping until noon and meeting friends for brunch that would stretch lazily into happy hour. Now most of my friends were married or had moved away, or both, and sleeping until noon felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. I rubbed my eyes and reached for my coffee cup, only to find it disappointingly light. When had I finished it? The cafe wasn't particularly busy. Just a handful of other laptop warriors scattered at various tables, a couple sharing a pastry near the back, an older woman reading a thick paperback in the corner. The kind of quiet Saturday morning crowd that existed in comfortable, mutual isolation. Standing to get a refill, I felt that familiar pat-down ritual that had become second nature over the years. Keys in the right pocket, phone in the left, wallet in the back right. Except my hand found nothing but fabric and the faint outline of my back pocket's seam. The first wave of panic was always the same, that cold, sinking sensation that started in your chest and radiated outward. I tried the other pockets, even though I knew it was pointless. I'd had the same wallet for 6 years, a leather bifold that my sister had given me for Christmas, and I kept it in the same place every single day. It was brown and worn soft at the edges, with a small scratch on the front from when I dropped it in a parking garage 2 years ago. I tried to retrace my steps. I definitely had it when I paid for my coffee earlier, and I could picture myself sliding my credit card across the counter to Jamie, the barista who always remembered that I liked my coffee black with just a touch of cinnamon. That was maybe an hour and 15 minutes ago. Since then, I'd only been sitting at this table, occasionally shifting positions as my back protested the wooden chair, unless it had fallen out when I'd walked here from my apartment. It was only 3 blocks, but 3 blocks in a city like Seattle might as well have been 3 miles when it came to recovering a lost wallet. By now, it could be in any number of hands. My credit card's already being tested at ATMs across the city. I pulled out my phone, already mentally preparing to spend the rest of my day calling banks and credit card companies. The door chimed, that bright brass sound that announced each new customer, but I barely registered it. I was scrolling through my contacts, trying to remember which bank I should call first, when a voice interrupted my growing spiral of anxiety. "Excuse me?" I looked up to find a stranger standing beside my table, and my first thought was that he looked slightly out of breath, as if he'd been walking quickly. He was maybe a few years younger than me, with dark hair that was a little messed up from the wind, and wearing a navy blue jacket over a simple gray sweater. There was something about his posture that suggested uncertainty, like he wasn't entirely sure he should be approaching me. "Are you David?" he asked, and I nodded automatically, though I couldn't for the life of me figure out how he knew my name. "David Chen?" "Yes, that's me," I said, and then he smiled. A warm, slightly shy expression that transformed his entire face, and held up something that made my heart skip with relief. My wallet. My brown-worn, perfectly familiar wallet. "I found this on the sidewalk outside," he said, extending it toward me. "Your driver's license was right there in the window, so I figured I'd see if you were still here." For a moment, I could only stare at him, at this complete stranger who had just solved what I'd been certain was about to become the worst part of my day. He was holding my wallet carefully, like it was something fragile, and I noticed that his hands were slightly red from the cold. I can't believe you found it, I said, reaching out to take it from him. I just realized it was missing and I was starting to panic about the moment our fingers touched. As he transferred the wallet to my hands, I felt something I wasn't expecting. It was just the briefest contact, his fingertips brushing against mine as I grasped the leather. But there was something electric about it that made me acutely aware of the warmth of his skin despite the coolness of the morning air still clinging to him. If he felt it too, he didn't show it. Instead, he stepped back slightly, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets with a self-conscious gesture that somehow made him seem younger than he probably was. Thank God, I said, flipping through the wallet quickly to confirm everything was still there. Driver's license, credit cards, the $23 in cash I'd been carrying, even the coffee shop loyalty card that was embarrassingly close to earning me a free drink. Everything's here. This is... wow. Thank you so much. He shrugged, but he was still smiling that warm, slightly uncertain smile. It's no big deal. I saw it lying there and figured someone was probably freaking out about it. You have no idea, I said, laughing with relief. I was just about to start calling my bank. Can I buy you a coffee as a thank you? The question surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. I wasn't typically the type to invite strangers to join me, especially not when I was trying to work. But something about the situation, or maybe something about him, made the offer feel natural. He hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if checking to see if anyone else had witnessed this interaction. You don't have to do that, he said. Really, I was just trying to be a decent human being. Which is exactly why I want to buy you a coffee, I insisted. Please, I promise I'm not some weirdo who's going to corner you with weird conversation. I really appreciate this, and it feels like the least I can do. He looked at me for a long moment, and I had the sense he was weighing something in his mind. His eyes were a warm brown, I noticed, with little gold flecks that caught the light from the window. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said, if you're sure you don't mind. I'm sure, I said, standing up and gesturing toward the counter. What do you drink? Coffee, he said, then immediately looked embarrassed by the obviousness of the answer. I mean, just regular coffee, black. We walked to the counter together, and I found myself hyper-aware of his presence beside me. He was maybe an inch or two shorter than my 6 feet, and he moved with a kind of easy grace that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin. His jacket was well worn but well cared for, the kind of thing you hold on to not because you can't afford better, but because it's exactly right. Jamie was behind the counter, her purple hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she greeted me with the same cheerful familiarity she always did. The usual? She asked, then noticed my companion and raised an eyebrow. And what can I get for your friend? 2 black coffees, I said, one with cinnamon, one without. Coming right up, Jamie said. And as she moved to prepare our drinks, an awkward silence settled between us. I realized I was standing perhaps a little closer to him than was strictly necessary. Close enough that I caught the faint scent of his soap or cologne, something clean and subtle that made me want to lean in further. So, I said, fishing for something to say, do you live around here? Not too far, he replied, which wasn't really an answer. About a 15-minute walk. I was just heading to the bookstore down the street when I saw your wallet. The used bookstore with the cat? His face lit up with genuine pleasure. You know Fitzgerald? The cat, I mean, not the author. Gray tabby with the attitude problem? That's the one, he said, laughing. He knocked a whole display of mysteries onto the floor last week while I was browsing. The owner just shook her head like it was a perfectly normal Tuesday. It probably was, I said. That cat has zero respect for the organizational system. We shared a smile over this, and some of the awkwardness began to dissolve. Jamie finished preparing our coffees and slid them across the counter, the ceramic mugs warming my hands as I picked them up. Should we sit? I asked, nodding toward my table by the window. Sure. We settled into the chairs across from each other, and I closed my laptop to give him my full attention. He wrapped his hands around his mug in a way that suggested he was still cold from being outside, and took a careful sip of the coffee. This is really good, he said, sounding surprised. This place has the best coffee in the neighborhood, I told him. I've been coming here for about 2 years now, and I've never had a bad cup. I'll have to remember that. He took another sip, then set the mug down and looked out the window. I don't usually... He trailed off, seeming to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. Don't usually what? I prompted gently. He looked back at me, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression. I don't usually do things like this. Like what? Return people's wallets? Like stay for coffee with strangers, he said, and there was a quality to his voice that made me think this admission meant more than the simple words suggested. I'm not really. I tend to keep to myself, I guess. I studied his face, trying to read the subtext in his words. There was something about the way he said it that made me wonder what keeping to himself looked like, whether it was by choice or circumstance, whether he was someone who had learned to be careful about letting people get close. Well, I said carefully, I'm glad you made an exception, and really thank you again. You could have just dropped it off at the counter and left, but you didn't. He could have just dropped it off at the counter and left, but he didn't. The thought echoed in my mind as I watched him process my words. There had been something intentional about his choice to approach me directly, something that suggested this interaction was as much about curiosity as it was about simple decency. I guess I wanted to make sure it got back to the right person, he said, but his fingers were fidgeting with his coffee mug in a way that suggested there might be more to it than that. Outside, the first drops of rain began to tap against the window, scattered and tentative at first, then growing more insistent. The sound created a kind of cocoon around us, making the cafe feel smaller and more intimate. I found myself noticing details about him that I might have missed in a more public setting. The way he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly while he talked, making small circles with his spoon even though he'd added nothing to the black coffee. The way his eyes would meet mine and hold for just a beat longer than strictly necessary before glancing away. The small scar on his left hand that looked like it might have come from a childhood accident. Do you come to the bookstore often? I asked, partly because I was genuinely curious and partly because I wanted to keep him talking. His voice was pleasant, with a slight rasp that suggested he might have been a smoker once, though I didn't smell tobacco on him. Maybe once a week, he said. I have a weakness for mystery novels and history books, pretty much anything that lets me disappear for a few hours. Escapism, I said, nodding. I get that, though lately I've been too busy with work to read much of anything that isn't a quarterly report. What do you do? Financial consulting, I said, which was technically true, though it made my job sound more interesting than it actually was. Basically, I help small businesses figure out how not to go bankrupt. Very thrilling stuff. He smiled at the self-deprecating tone in my voice. It sounds like important work, though, keeping people's dreams alive. The way he said it made me look at him more closely. There was something thoughtful about his perspective, the way he'd reframed my mundane job description into something that mattered. Most people, when I told them what I did for a living, either looked bored or made jokes about accountants. But he seemed to understand instinctively that behind every business was someone's passion project, someone's hope for a different kind of life. I hadn't thought of it that way, I said, but you're right. Some of my clients started their businesses because they were tired of working for someone else, or because they had this idea they just couldn't let go of. There's this woman I work with who opened a bakery after her kids grew up and moved out. She told me she'd been dreaming about it for 20 years. Did you help her make it work? So far, so good, I said. She's been profitable for 8 months now. Still has to get up at 4 in the morning to start the bread, but she says it's the happiest she's ever been. He smiled again, that same warm expression that seemed to light up his entire face. That's beautiful. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the window with increasing intensity. A few customers had come and gone while we were talking, but the cafe remained peacefully quiet. The kind of atmosphere that made you want to linger over your coffee and postpone whatever responsibilities were waiting outside. I realized I'd been watching the way he held his mug, both hands wrapped around it like he was absorbing its warmth. And when I looked up, I found him watching me watch him. For a moment, neither of us looked away, and there was something in that held gaze that felt significant, like we were having a conversation without words. Then he cleared his throat softly and glanced down at his coffee, and the moment passed, but it left something behind. A awareness, maybe, or a possibility that hadn't been there before. What about you? I asked. What do you do when you're not rescuing people's wallets? He hesitated, and I got the sense that this was a question he didn't particularly enjoy answering. I'm a graphic designer, he said finally. Freelance, mostly. Logos, web design, that kind of thing. That sounds creative. It can be, he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested it wasn't always. Depends on the client. Some people know exactly what they want and just need someone to execute it. Others think they want something completely different every week. The joys of working with people, I said sympathetically. Exactly. He took another sip of his coffee, and I noticed that his hands had warmed up. They no longer looked red from the cold, and he wasn't holding the mug quite so tightly. But I like working for myself, setting my own schedule, choosing my projects when I can afford to be picky. Do you have a studio or do you work from home? Home office, he said. Well, home corner of my living room, really. It's not very glamorous, but it gets the job done. I tried to picture it. This stranger sitting at a desk in the corner of some apartment I'd never seen, working on designs for clients who probably never bothered to learn his name. There was something solitary about the image that made me curious about what the rest of his life looked like. Did he live alone? Did he have friends he met for drinks after work, or was he the type to spend his evenings reading those mystery novels he'd mentioned? That takes discipline, I said. Working from home. I think I'd get distracted by everything that needed cleaning or fixing. You learn to ignore it, he said, but he was smiling. Though I'll admit there have been days when I've reorganized my entire bookshelf instead of working on a project that was due. Productive procrastination, I said. I'm familiar with the concept. He laughed, a warm sound that made me want to say something else that would make him laugh again. There was something infectious about his amusement, the way it transformed his whole face and made him seem less guarded. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the window, and I found myself hoping it wouldn't stop anytime soon. Not because I particularly minded getting wet, but because the sound of it seemed to create a bubble around us. A reason to stay seated and keep talking instead of acknowledging that our business here was technically finished. He had returned my wallet. I had bought him a coffee in thanks. By all logical measures, this interaction should be winding down, moving toward polite farewells and separate departures into the rainy afternoon. Instead, we were settling deeper into our chairs, our conversation finding a comfortable rhythm that suggested neither of us was in a hurry to leave. Can I ask you something? I said, then immediately wondered if I was about to overstep some boundary I didn't fully understand. Sure. When you said you don't usually do things like this, staying for coffee with strangers, what did you mean? Are you just private or? I let the question trail off, giving him space to answer or deflect as he chose. He considered this for a moment, stirring his coffee again in those slow, thoughtful circles. I guess I've gotten into the habit of keeping people at arm's length, he said finally. Not in a rude way, I hope, but I tend to stick to my routine. Keep interactions manageable. Manageable, I repeated, testing the word. That's an interesting way to put it. Is it? He looked up at me, and there was something almost curious in his expression, like he was genuinely interested in how his words had landed. It makes relationships sound like a project that might get out of hand if you're not careful, I said. He was quiet for a moment, and I worried I'd pushed too hard, gotten too personal too quickly. But then he nodded slowly. Maybe that's not entirely wrong, he said. I've had experiences that made me think it was safer to keep things simple. The way he said experiences made it clear that this wasn't territory he wanted to explore with someone he'd just met, and I respected that. Everyone had their reasons for the walls they built, and it wasn't my place to try to tear them down over coffee with a stranger. I understand that, I said instead, though I have to say, I'm grateful you made an exception today. Me too, he said, and the sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us drinking our coffee and listening to the rain. I found myself studying his profile as he gazed out the window. The strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell slightly across his forehead, the concentration in his expression as he watched the water streak down the glass. There was something about him that drew my attention in a way I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just that he was attractive, though he certainly was. It was something more subtle. The way he moved, the thoughtfulness behind his words, the sense that there were layers to him that would take time to understand. Time. The word stuck in my mind because it implied a future, a possibility of getting to know him beyond this single interaction, and I realized, sitting there, in the warm glow of the cafe while the rain created a private world around us, that I wanted that. I wanted to know what books he was reading, what projects he was working on, what made him laugh, and what made him retreat into that careful distance he described. The rain's really coming down now, he observed, and I followed his gaze to see that he was right. What had started as scattered drops had become a steady downpour, the kind of October rain that would soak you through in minutes. Good thing we're in here, I said. Good thing, he agreed, but he didn't sound like he was in any hurry for it to stop. I glanced at my phone and was surprised to discover that we'd been talking for over an hour. The time had passed without my noticing, which almost never happened when I was making conversation with someone new. Usually, I was acutely aware of every pause, every potential awkwardness, the social mathematics of when it was appropriate to end an interaction. But with him, the conversation had flowed so naturally that I'd lost track of time entirely. I should probably let you get back to your day, he said, as if he'd been thinking along similar lines. But he made no move to stand up, and his coffee mug was still half full. You're not keeping me from anything, I assured him. Those spreadsheets will still be boring whether I look at them now or later. He smiled at that. But there was something almost wistful in the expression. What kind of spreadsheets? Budget projections for a client who owns 3 restaurants, I said. He's thinking about opening a 4th, but the numbers are complicated. Complicated how? I found myself explaining the situation in more detail than I would have expected to share with a stranger. The way the client's existing restaurants were profitable, but not consistently so. How the new location he was considering was in a great spot, but came with significantly higher rent. The challenge of projecting cash flow when the restaurant industry was still recovering from the disruptions of the past few years. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood the complexity of the situation. It occurred to me that I was enjoying talking about my work in a way I hadn't in months, maybe because he was approaching it from the perspective of someone who understood what it meant to run your own business, to take risks and hope they paid off. It sounds like he's lucky to have you helping him figure it out, he said when I finished explaining the various scenarios I was modeling. I hope so, I said. Sometimes I feel like I'm just the person who puts numbers on other people's dreams and hopes they add up to something sustainable. But that's important, he said earnestly. Dreams without plans are just wishes. You're helping people build something real. Again, I was struck by his ability to reframe things in a way that made them seem more meaningful. It was a quality I found increasingly attractive, the way he seemed to look beneath the surface of things, to find significance in the ordinary details of life. Thank you, I said. I don't think I've ever had someone make my job sound so noble. I don't think it's about nobility, he said thoughtfully. I think it's about caring whether other people succeed. Not everyone does that. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm now, and the cafe had grown even quieter as the afternoon wore on. A few customers had left, and no new ones had arrived in the past 20 minutes. We had become, almost without realizing it, the kind of couple that cafe workers probably noticed. 2 people who had clearly moved beyond casual acquaintance into something that looked like a date, even if it hadn't started as one. I watched him take another sip of his coffee and noticed that he was reaching the bottom of the cup. My own mug was nearly empty as well, which meant we were approaching the natural end of this interaction. Soon, one of us would suggest that we should probably head out, and we would stand up and walk to the door and say goodbye, and then what? Would we exchange numbers? Would he disappear back into his carefully managed life, leaving me with nothing but the memory of a pleasant conversation and the knowledge that there were still decent people in the world who returned lost wallets? The thought of not seeing him again created an unexpected sense of loss, which surprised me. I barely knew him. I didn't even know his name, I realized with a start. But something about this conversation had felt important in a way I couldn't quite define. It had been a long time since I'd talked with someone who made me want to ask more questions, to learn more about the way they saw the world. I just realized, I said. I never asked your name. Oh, he said, and for a moment he looked almost startled, as if he'd forgotten this too. But before he could finish the sentence, Jamie's voice rang out from behind the counter. Medium oat milk latte with an extra shot. The interruption broke the moment like a stone thrown into still water. He glanced toward the counter where a customer was stepping forward to claim their drink, and when he looked back at me, something had shifted in his expression. The vulnerability that had been there moments before was replaced by something more guarded, as if he was remembering the boundaries he usually maintained. I should probably go, he said, checking his phone. The rain seems to be letting up a little. I looked outside and saw that he was right. The downpour had gentled to a steadier but lighter rain, the kind you could walk in if you didn't mind getting a little wet. But I wasn't ready for this to end, not yet, not when we'd been so close to exchanging names and maybe possibly phone numbers. Are you sure? I asked. I could buy you another coffee. But he was already standing, reaching for his jacket with movements that suggested his mind was made up. The spell that had held us in this warm private bubble for the past hour was breaking, and I could feel him retreating back into whatever careful distance he maintained with the world. Thank you, he said, and his smile was warm, but somehow more formal than it had been moments before. For the coffee and for this was really nice. It was, I agreed, standing as well, though every instinct was telling me to find a way to extend this interaction, to bridge the gap between this moment and the possibility of future ones. He pulled on his jacket and headed for the door, and I followed, my mind racing through possible ways to ask for his number that wouldn't seem too forward or desperate. But by the time we reached the door, I still hadn't found the right words, and he was already pushing it open, letting in a gust of cool, rain-scented air. Take care of that wallet, he said, turning back to face me with that same shy smile that had greeted me when he'd first approached my table. I will, I said, and thank you again, really. He nodded, and for just a moment he hesitated on the threshold as if he might say something else, but then he stepped out into the rain, pulling his hood up as he walked away, and I was left standing in the doorway watching him disappear into the gray afternoon. I returned to my table feeling unsettled, as if I'd just experienced something significant, but couldn't quite name what it was. My laptop was still open to the same spreadsheet I'd been working on when this whole interaction began, but the numbers seemed even less important now than they had before. Instead, I found myself replaying the conversation, analyzing every moment and gesture for clues about who he was and what it had meant to him. He could have just dropped it off at the counter and left, but he didn't. The thought returned to me as I packed up my things, and I wondered if I was reading too much into it or if there had been something intentional about his choice to stay. The way he'd said he didn't usually do things like this, had that been about returning wallets or about staying for coffee or about something else entirely? I walked home through the gentle rain, my wallet secure in my pocket, thinking about brown eyes with gold flecks and the way someone could make ordinary conversation feel like a discovery. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd already decided that I would return to the cafe next Saturday morning, and maybe the Saturday after that, hoping that he might do the same. Because something had started in that cafe, something that felt too important to let slip away into the gray anonymity of the city. I didn't know his name or his phone number or even his last name, but I knew that he read mystery novels and stirred his coffee in thoughtful circles and had a way of making other people's work sound meaningful. And I knew that I wanted to see him again. The barista had called out that order just as I was about to ask his name, breaking the moment and sending him back out into the rain before we could exchange any of the details that would have made this interaction more than just a pleasant memory. But maybe that interruption had been a kind of gift, I thought as I unlocked my apartment door. Maybe it had left us both with questions that would bring us back to the same place, looking for answers. I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about him instead of working on spreadsheets. And for once, I didn't feel guilty about the distraction. Some things I was beginning to understand were more important than quarterly projections. Some conversations were worth having, even if they ended before you learned the other person's name. Especially then. Part 2, but as I stood there in the doorway watching him pull his hood up against the rain, something in me refused to let this moment end so quietly. The barista's interruption had broken our rhythm, yeah, but it didn't have to break our connection entirely. Wait, I called out, perhaps a little louder than necessary. He turned back, rain already beginning to dampen his shoulders, eyebrows raised in question. For a heartbeat, I stood there, trying to find words that wouldn't sound desperate or presumptuous. But then I realized that sometimes the simplest approach was the best one. I still don't know your name, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. And that careful distance he'd been rebuilding seemed to soften again. He took a step back toward the cafe, close enough that we could talk without shouting over the sound of the rain. It's Alex, he said, and his smile was warmer now, less guarded than it had been moments before. Alex Morrison. David Chen. And I said, though he already knew that from my driver's license. It's nice to officially meet you, Alex Morrison. You too, David Chen, he replied, and the way he said my full name made it sound like something worth remembering. We stood there for a moment, both of us getting lightly misted by the rain that was blowing in through the open door. and I could see him weighing something in his mind. Finally, he glanced back toward our table by the window. You know what? He said. It's really coming down out there. Maybe I could stay for just a few more minutes, if you don't mind the company. I don't mind at all, I said, trying not to let my relief show too obviously. Should we get another round? He nodded and we walked back to the counter together. This time the order felt less like a polite transaction and more like a shared decision to extend whatever was happening between us. Jamie raised an eyebrow as she prepared our second cups of coffee, but she didn't comment, just added an extra dash of cinnamon to mine with a knowing smile. Back at our table, Alex settled into his chair with a more relaxed posture than before, as if the simple act of exchanging names had given him permission to stay a little longer, to let his guard down a little further. The rain was drumming more insistently against the window now, creating a steady white noise that seemed to wrap around us like a cocoon. So, Alex Morrison, I said, testing the way his name felt in my mouth. Graphic designer, mystery novel enthusiast, and good Samaritan. What else should I know about you? He laughed, a sound I was already growing fond of. That's a pretty complete summary, actually, though I suppose there are a few other details, such as... He took a sip of his coffee, and I noticed that he'd stopped wrapping his hands around the mug for warmth. His fingers looked elegant as they curved around the handle. Artist's hands, I thought, though. I couldn't say exactly what made them seem that way. Well, he said thoughtfully, I moved to Seattle about 8 months ago, from Portland originally, still figuring out the city, really. What brought you here? The question seemed to catch him off guard, or maybe it was just that the answer was complicated. He was quiet for a moment, staring down into his coffee as if it might contain some wisdom he needed. Change, he said finally. I needed a change. My life in Portland had gotten stagnant, I guess. Same routine, same places, same people. I felt like I was sleepwalking through my days. There was something in his voice that suggested this change hadn't been entirely voluntary, or at least not entirely easy. I waited to see if he would elaborate, but he seemed content to leave it at that general explanation. I can understand that, I said. Sometimes you need to shake things up to remember who you are. Exactly, he said, looking up at me with something like gratitude. Though I'll admit, the adjustment has been harder than I expected. It's one thing to want a fresh start, and another thing entirely to actually build a new life from scratch. It was supposed to be a thank you coffee, but now I wasn't ready for it to end. The thought drifted through my mind as I watched him talk about his move. The way his expression grew slightly distant when he mentioned building a new life. There was something vulnerable about the admission, something that made me want to know more about what he'd left behind and what he was hoping to find here. What's been the hardest part? I asked. He considered this, stirring his coffee in those same thoughtful circles I'd noticed before. The loneliness, I suppose. In Portland, I had a whole network of friends and familiar places. Here, I know exactly 3 people. My upstairs neighbor, who sometimes borrows sugar, the woman who runs the bookstore, and now you. The way he included me in that short list made something warm bloom in my chest. It was such a simple thing, but it felt significant. The acknowledgement that our conversation had moved us from strangers to something more, even if we couldn't quite name what that something was. That is a pretty short list, I agreed, but it's a start. And 8 months isn't very long to build a whole new social circle, especially if you're working from home most of the time. True, he said. I keep telling myself I should join some kind of club or class, meet people with similar interests, but then I get caught up in work, or I talk myself out of it, or I don't know. It's easier to stay home and read. I understood that impulse more than I cared to admit. My own social life had narrowed considerably over the past few years, not because of a move, but because of a kind of gradual drift that happened when you got busy with work and stopped making the effort to maintain friendships. Most of my college friends were scattered across the country now, married or focused on careers that left little time for casual socializing. I had colleagues, but we rarely saw each other outside the office. I had neighbors, but we exchanged pleasantries and not much more. I get that, I said. It takes energy to put yourself out there, especially when you're already dealing with all the other adjustments that come with a big move. What about you? He asked. Are you from Seattle originally? Born and raised, I said. Which has its own challenges, actually. Sometimes I feel like I've gotten too comfortable, too settled in my routines. I live in the same neighborhood I grew up in, work with some of the same people I went to college with. There's something to be said for stability, but Sometimes I wonder if I've gotten stuck. It was a more honest answer than I'd expected to give, and I realized that something about Alex's openness was encouraging me to be equally candid. There was something about the way he listened, fully present, without judgment, that made it easier to admit things I rarely said out loud. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. "But then I think about starting over somewhere new, not knowing anyone or anything, and it seems overwhelming. I admire people like you who actually make the leap. Even when they end up sitting alone in bookstores, befriending antisocial cats." I laughed. "Especially then. At least you're doing something different. I'm the one who's been going to the same cafe every Saturday for 2 years." "There's nothing wrong with finding a place you like and sticking with it," Alex said. "This is a good cafe. Great coffee, nice atmosphere, friendly baristas who remember your order." He glanced around the space appreciatively. "And apparently it's the kind of place where good things happen." "Good things?" "Well," he said, and there was something almost shy in his smile. "I found a lost wallet, met someone interesting, and discovered a new favorite coffee shop all in the same afternoon. I'd call that a pretty good day." The casual way he called me interesting made my pulse quicken slightly. It wasn't exactly flirtation, the tone was too gentle, too sincere for that, but it was definitely something more than polite conversation. There was an awareness between us now, a recognition that this interaction had moved beyond the simple transaction of wallet returning and thank you coffee into something neither of us had planned but both seemed reluctant to end. "You know," I said, "I was just thinking the same thing. This morning I was sitting here, dreading a weekend full of spreadsheets, and now—" I gestured vaguely, trying to capture the feeling of unexpected possibility that had settled over the afternoon. "Now? Now I'm having the most interesting conversation I've had in months, with someone I probably never would have met under normal circumstances." "Normal circumstances," Alex repeated thoughtfully. "I guess there wasn't anything normal about today. I mean, what are the odds? You lose your wallet, I happen to find it, you happen to still be at the exact place where you lost it, and you happen to be the type of person who returns wallets to their owners personally instead of just dropping them at the nearest police station. And you happen to be the type of person who invites strangers to stay for coffee." We looked at each other across the small table, both of us seeming to acknowledge that there were indeed a lot of coincidences that had to align for this moment to exist. The rain outside had grown heavier, as if it too were conspiring to keep us in this warm, dry space together. "Maybe it wasn't just coincidence," I said, then immediately felt foolish for voicing something so sentimental. But Alex didn't look like he thought it was foolish. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he'd been thinking along similar lines. "I don't usually believe in that kind of thing," he said. "Fate or destiny or whatever you want to call it. But today, I don't know. There was something that made me want to return the wallet personally instead of just leaving it with the barista. Something that made me say yes when you offered to buy me coffee." "What do you think it was?" He was quiet for a moment, and I watched him search for words to explain something that probably couldn't be easily explained. "Curiosity, maybe?" he said finally. "Or loneliness, or just the sense that you seemed like someone worth talking to." The honesty of it took my breath away slightly. We were moving into territory that felt both more intimate and more uncertain, acknowledging things that were usually left unspoken in casual encounters. But there was something about the rain and the warm cafe and the way Alex's eyes held mine that made it feel safe to be direct. "I felt that too," I admitted, "from the moment you walked in here. There was something about you that made me want to know more." "Really?" There was genuine surprise in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe that he'd made that kind of impression. It made me wonder about his move from Portland, about what had left him feeling like he needed to keep people at arm's length. Had someone made him doubt his ability to connect with others? Had he been hurt in ways that made it hard to trust his instincts about people? "Really," I said firmly, "you have this way of listening that makes people want to tell you things, and you see meaning in ordinary situations that most people would just take for granted." "I do. You made my boring job sound noble. You turned returning a wallet into something that mattered. I paused, trying to find the right words. "You make things feel more significant than they did before." He looked down at his coffee, but I could see that he was pleased by what I'd said. There was color in his cheeks that hadn't been there before, and his smile was softer, less guarded. "That's a lovely thing to say," he said quietly. It's a true thing to say. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us processing this shift in the conversation. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the window, and I found myself grateful for every drop that kept us anchored in this space together. Can I ask you something? Alex said eventually. Of course. What made you offer to buy me coffee? I mean, really. It would have been perfectly reasonable to just say thank you and leave it at that. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since the moment the words had left my mouth. I'd replayed that interaction several times, trying to understand what had prompted the invitation, and I still wasn't entirely sure I had a complete answer. Partly gratitude, I said. You saved me from what would have been a really stressful afternoon. But also, I hesitated, then decided to be honest. Also because I didn't want you to leave yet. There was something about you that made me curious. Curious about what? About who you are, about what you're thinking when you get that distant look in your eyes, about whether you're as kind to everyone as you were to me, or if there's something special about wallet returning that brings out your good Samaritan tendencies. Alex laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. I think you're giving me too much credit. Most days I'm pretty ordinary. I doubt that, I said. But even if it were true, ordinary can be pretty extraordinary when you're lonely. The word hung between us for a moment. Lonely. And I realized I'd just admitted something about myself that I hadn't planned to share. But Alex didn't look uncomfortable with the admission. Instead, he nodded with understanding. Yes, he said simply. It can be. There was something in the way he said it that made me think he understood exactly what I meant. Not the dramatic loneliness of romantic movies, where people pine dramatically and write sad poetry, but the quieter kind that crept up on you gradually. The kind that made you realize you could go days without having a meaningful conversation with another person, that you could sit in restaurants surrounded by people and still feel fundamentally alone. Is that why you moved to Seattle? I asked. Were you lonely in Portland too? He considered this question longer than most of the others I'd asked, and I got the sense that it was touching on something more complicated than simple geography. Not exactly, he said finally. I mean, I had friends there, people I saw regularly. But I think I was lonely in a different way. Lonely in my own life, if that makes sense. It does, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure it did. I felt like I was living someone else's version of what my life should look like, and he continued. Good job. Nice apartment, social circle, all the markers of a successful adult life. But none of it felt quite right. None of it felt like me. So you left. So I left, he confirmed. Quit my job at a design firm, broke my lease, packed everything I owned into a U-Haul, and drove north. It was terrifying and exhilarating and probably not entirely rational. What wasn't right about your life there? Another long pause, and I could see him debating how much to share. We were still strangers, after all, even if we'd moved beyond the most superficial level of conversation. There were reasonable boundaries around how much personal history you revealed over coffee with someone you'd met an hour ago. I think I was trying to be someone I'm not, he said carefully, making choices based on what other people expected rather than what I actually wanted. It took me a while to realize that the problem wasn't the specific circumstances of my life. It was that I wasn't being honest about who I was and what mattered to me. There was something in the way he phrased this that made me think there were layers to the story he wasn't sharing, but I didn't push. Everyone had parts of their past that were too complex or too private to explain to someone new, no matter how comfortable the conversation felt. And now, I asked, do you feel like you're being more honest? I'm trying to be, he said. It's harder than I expected, though. When you've spent years making choices based on other people's expectations, it takes time to figure out what your own expectations actually are. I nodded, understanding this more than he might have guessed. My own life had been shaped by a series of practical decisions that had made sense at the time, but had gradually led me away from the things I'd once thought I wanted. College major chosen for job security rather than passion. Career path selected for stability rather than excitement. Even this neighborhood, this apartment, this cafe routine, all of it reasonable and sensible, and somehow not quite right. I think a lot of people struggle with that, I said. The difference is that most of us just keep going with the status quo instead of actually doing something about it. Is that what you're doing? The question was asked gently, without judgment, but it still made me pause. Was I just going with the status quo? Was my comfortable routine actually a kind of trap I'd built for myself? Probably, I admitted, though talking to you is making me think maybe I shouldn't be. What would you change if you could change anything? It was such a simple question, but it stumped me completely. I sat there stirring my coffee and trying to identify what, specifically, I would want to be different about my life, and realized I'd been so focused on maintaining what I had that I'd stopped thinking about what I might want instead. I don't know, I said finally. Isn't that pathetic? You asked me what I'd change about my life, and I can't even come up with an answer. It's not pathetic, Alex said firmly. It's just honest. And it's probably more common than you think. Change is scary, even when you're not happy with the way things are. Is that why it took you so long to leave Portland? Partly, he said. And partly because I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just that I wasn't finding it where I was. At least you have the self-awareness to recognize that something might be missing. That's the first step. The first step toward what? Toward figuring out what you actually want your life to look like. We fell into another comfortable silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The rain outside had settled into a steady rhythm, and the cafe had grown even quieter as the afternoon wore on. I found myself watching Alex's face as he gazed out the window, noting the way the gray light from outside cast shadows along his jawline, the way his fingers drummed absently against his coffee mug. You know what's funny? I said eventually. What? This morning, I was sitting here thinking about how isolated I've become, how my social life has shrunk down to basically nothing. And now here I am having the most honest conversation I've had in months with someone I met 2 hours ago. Alex turned his attention back to me, and there was something warm and understanding in his expression. Sometimes it's easier to be honest with strangers, he said. There's less baggage, fewer expectations. You can just be yourself without worrying about how it fits with someone's existing idea of who you are. Is that what this is? Us being ourselves? I think so, he said. At least it feels more like myself than I've felt in a while. The admission created a moment of shared vulnerability that felt significant. We were acknowledging that something was happening here, something that went beyond politeness or casual friendliness. We were connecting in a way that surprised both of us, and we were both aware enough of that connection to comment on it. Me too, I said. It's strange, isn't it? How you can know someone for your entire adult life and still feel like you're performing some version of yourself, but then you meet a complete stranger, and suddenly you're saying things you didn't even know you were thinking. Maybe that's why I approached you directly instead of just leaving the wallet with the barista, Alex said thoughtfully. Maybe some part of me sensed that you might be someone I could talk to honestly. You think? I don't know, he said, smiling, but I'm glad I did. Me too. The conversation lapsed again, but it was the kind of comfortable silence that felt natural rather than awkward. We were both processing what we'd shared, I thought, and maybe also trying to figure out where this interaction was headed. The practical part of my mind was reminding me that we were still essentially strangers, that profound conversations over coffee didn't necessarily translate into lasting connections. But another part of me, a part I hadn't listened to in years, was suggesting that some encounters were worth taking seriously, worth exploring, even when you couldn't predict where they might lead. David? Alex said, and the way he said my name made me look up for my coffee. Yeah? Thank you for this, for the coffee, and for making me feel less alone today. The sincerity in his voice made something tighten in my chest. Thank you for returning my wallet, I said, and for staying. I needed this conversation more than I realized. He smiled, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the small table, acknowledging what had passed between us. Then he glanced at his phone and his expression shifted slightly. I should probably think about heading home soon, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely eager to do so. I have a project deadline on Monday that I've been avoiding all weekend. Of course, I said, though I felt the same reluctance to end this interaction that I heard in his voice. The rain seems to be letting up a little. We both looked toward the window, where the steady downpour had indeed gentled to a lighter but persistent drizzle. It was the kind of weather that wouldn't really stop you from walking, but wouldn't be particularly pleasant either. Yeah, Alex said, but he made no immediate move to gather his things. Instead, he sat there looking like he was trying to decide something, and I found myself holding my breath slightly, hoping he might say whatever was on his mind. David, he said finally, and there was something almost nervous in his tone. I know we just met, and I don't want to presume anything, but would you maybe want to do this again sometime? I mean, not the wallet returning part, obviously, but the coffee and conversation part. The relief I felt was so profound it was almost dizzying. Yes, I said, probably more quickly than was entirely cool. I'd like that a lot. Really? Really, I confirmed. When? He pulled out his phone and opened what looked like a calendar app. Next Saturday? Same time, same place? It's a date, I said, then immediately wondered if that was too forward a way to put it. But Alex's smile suggested he didn't mind the phrasing. It's a date, he agreed, and something about the way he repeated the words made them feel official, like a promise we were making to each other. We exchanged phone numbers then, typing our contact information into each other's phones with the kind of care usually reserved for important documents. When Alex handed my phone back to me, I noticed he'd entered himself as Alex, wallet guy, which made me laugh. So I don't forget how we met, he said with a grin. I don't think there's much danger of that. We finished our coffees and gathered our things, moving with the slow reluctance of people who weren't quite ready to return to the world outside this warm, quiet space. When we reached the door, Alex paused with his hand on the handle. This was really nice, he said. I'm glad you called after me. I almost just kept walking. I'm glad I did too, I said. And I'm glad you found my wallet. Best lost wallet ever, he said. And we both laughed at the absurdity of the statement. Then he pushed open the door and stepped out into the light rain, turning back to wave as he walked away. I stood in the doorway watching him until he turned the corner and disappeared from sight, my mind already jumping ahead to next Saturday, to the possibility of more conversations like this one, to the question of where this unexpected connection might lead. As I finally made my own way home through the drizzle, I realized that the wallet wasn't the only thing I'd gotten back that morning. Somewhere in the space of 2 hours and as many cups of coffee, I'd rediscovered something I hadn't even known I'd lost. The possibility that life could still surprise you, that meaningful connections could still happen when you least expected them, that maybe the comfortable routines I'd built weren't as satisfying as I'd convinced myself they were. I thought about Alex walking through the rain, toward whatever apartment he called home, toward the corner of his living room where he worked on designs for clients who probably never bothered to learn his name. I thought about his admission that he was trying to figure out what he actually wanted his life to look like, and I realized I was now asking myself the same question. What did I want my life to look like? For the first time in years, the question felt urgent rather than abstract, like something that demanded an answer rather than something I could continue to postpone indefinitely. By the time I reached my building, I had already decided that next Saturday couldn't come soon enough, and